quite a bit on renewable energy technologies in the past few days. If you've been at the COP recently, in the last couple of days, you've heard of increased calls for tripling the amount of renewable capacity globally. And all this talk is made possible by one of the key stakeholders in ensuring that we make sure that the targets are achievable, are associations who work together with research, with industry, with policymakers, to ensure that we are on the path in achieving all these international goals. So on this table here in the session, we have the leading associations in solar, in wind, in bioenergy, and in hydropower together to share their perspectives. And there are a few things that they're going to address. They're going to share the latest statistics on different technologies, and they're going to talk a little bit about emerging markets, and also most importantly, the socio-economic benefits of having renewable energy technologies as well. And each speaker will have about 12 minutes or so for their intervention, so that then I hope we have 20 to 30 minutes at the end for any questions or discussions afterwards. But before we go into the associations, I'm pleased to welcome a representative from CAN International, which most of you might be well aware of. I hope, it's always funny when people find it hard to pronounce my name, but now I'm on the other side, so I'll try my best and invite Kwaile from CAN International to give the initial presentation from CAN International perspective.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us here on our side event here. I'm from CAN International, Climate Action Network. My name is Kwaile Monaheng. I'm from the Kingdom of Lesotho, least developed country, enveloped inside South Africa. So renewable energy, energy efficiency is something that's quite close to my heart. So this is something that's really important and very timely at this COP to talk about. So I'll just get us started. Next slide, please. Do I have a clicker? Oh, okay, cool. So CAN International is a network, a global network of international organizations and NGOs. There's around 2,000 NGOs currently in over 130 countries worldwide. And our focus areas are there. They really speak to centering people and climate impacts, climate impacts, the ending fossil fuels as well, and transformative national climate action plans, as well as multilateral advocacy, hence why we're here at COP. So we really represent 2,000 plus organizations, really do a global footprint, and we really draw our strength from our nodes who are coming into this next slide here, where we operate in 130 countries. There are national and regional nodes as well. And currently, like I said, there was over 1,900 members in over 150 countries. But I mean, right now, that number has probably gone to over 2,000 currently. There's 11 regional nodes and 13 national nodes at present. So there we are, there within the network. My job today is to talk energy. So I'm the renewable energy expert at the Platform for Action on Renewable Energy. This is relatively new. It's 2 years into CAN International. And we are basically an organization or an arm or a platform of CAN rather that looks to really spearhead the work on renewable energy. And we believe that renewable energy should be just, equitable, and phase out of fossil fuels, as well as the expansion of renewables to achieve 100% renewable energy. And our platform is made out of different associations, experts, and allies as we look to tackle and promote energy efficiency, renewable energy infrastructure. I think my colleagues here will chat to that again today, all to do with combating environmental challenges in the context of energy. And those are our values there, which are to do with sustainability of energy, energy equality, accessibility, affordability, as well as clean energy. The current renewable energy context really anchors us now. It's no surprise now that we know that renewable energy is growing. This figure comes from the IEA, and it's really talking about how the global energy crisis has driven renewable energy. There's a need for it now, as well as the global policy momentum that's catching up with this need for renewable energy growth. And this really talks about looking at how the renewable energy capacity has grown, and this is from 2017 to projections to 2024. We're noticing here that in terms of capacity, what we're realizing in terms of the numbers, there's 107 gigawatts sort of projected into 2024 or along that 7-year period, and it's the largest absolute increase to date. Solar and wind are the ones that have actually excelled more than the others in this context. By next year, we're looking to see, or rather 2023, 2024, we're looking to see around 550 gigawatts in 2024. So that's quite, the need for renewable energy. It really anchors our conversation. And here is just sort of thinking about the policy space. And this figure comes from REN21's Global Status Report this year, the one for 2023, that really speaks to countries really uptaking renewable energy, countries really sort of committing to 100% or rather renewable energy targets. In total, 128 countries have economy-wide targets. Unfortunately, only 31 of these countries had 100% renewable energy targets, but that's still a good number. We expect this number to grow as well. And as you can see from that graph, it's quite globally distributed as well. The socio-economic benefits of renewable energy are fast and fair between. We all know that the benefits are really around a multi-beneficial system. It's not just one thing, it unlocks also opportunities. So this table really talks about what the initial benefits are and what the opportunities are unlocked by renewable energy on the other side. So we're talking about energy access, and that's something very important to least developed countries, particularly when we're talking about Africa, where there's over 600 million people still without grid electricity. So that's something that's quite important to think about when it comes to energy access and the role it plays in sort of electrifying rural areas, something that's very, very important. When we come down to the skills and opportunities created by renewable energy, it's the energy of the future, the system of the future. So it's very important that jobs align and skills align to sort of prepare for it in the future as well. And obviously there's something to think about as community engagement and local empowerment. When done correctly, when centered around people, and this is something that we take very seriously at CAN, when it's centered around people, when it's people-based, when it's bottom-up, it really speaks to the local realities on the ground, hence why it can be taken, hence why there can be more ownership with renewable energy. And then the opportunities, they're really putting people at the center. You're talking about the role in which renewable energy really is taken up by communities, and that's something that keeps the renewable energy sustainable, because communities are now having a local buy-in, a local ownership, and more importantly, it's context specific. We all have different needs from all over the world, so this is something that we need to take into context. And also enhancing social equity. Policymakers, governments should also understand the importance of this as well when it comes to single households as well, alongside clean energy initiatives. Then the last one there is really talking to communities as equals, really involving them in the decision making that also sustains the success of renewable energy as a whole. And this is just a graph, or rather a diagram, to sort of talk about the welfare benefits I've just explained. Moving on to the barriers of mobilization for renewable energy. The usual industry ones are on the left, and these are normal ones considering planning and permitting of renewable energy barriers. We know that this is a great challenge. Renewable energy permitting takes quite a long time. So that's something to consider as well. And there's a lack in grid capacity. Even if there's a need for renewable energy, where is it all going to go? So we still need to build up that infrastructure to receive that type of energy. And the last one there, or the second last one there, is the ongoing supply chain disruptions. And that's also related to critical minerals, the critical minerals race, where we're seeing that prices are being driven up. There's volatility in the prices of critical minerals, hence why there's supply chain disruptions there when it comes to energy, or why certain countries, i.e. China, has the most supply of renewable energy worldwide. That really unbalances the markets as a whole. And then that one there is for least developed countries or countries that have populations in rural areas that are more dispersed. It's very difficult to sort of bring the case for big grid or maybe more mini grid based electrification in these areas. And then on the other side, no surprises there, the fossil fuel industry. These announcements of new products really contradict the fair, fast, and full funded phase out of fossil fuels. We still see these being expanded. We still see the fossil fuel industry really try to sort of continue and not phase down. You know, that's something that we're discussing here at COP, as you know, so it's not a surprise there. And the idea of false solutions and dangerous distractions. CCS is one of them, and you know, the other baited fossil fuel technologies there. And then the distraction there of companies really greening, I think that's a strategy that fossil fuel companies do. We're still trying to green the process of the phase out. You know, it needs to stop. We need to really halt it in order to give space for renewable energy. The science speaks to that right now. And then this is just something to look at financing. The biggest banks or biggest financial players are still sort of giving subsidies to fossil fuel companies, i.e. renewables. So you can see that the contrast is, there's a big contrast there. I mean, only 53 billion out of the 395 billion, you know, that's a big figure to consider in terms of funding. So one thing that was really important that I really wanted to talk about here is transforming the energy system, which also then unlocks the sort of these barriers as well. That's what CAN International tries to do. And RAN Alliance, in the brief to come here, talked about the importance of electrifying at all levels. And that's very important because that's what also CAN talks about. There's really the idea of the role of communities being at play here. And the CAN position in that is that we try to make an energy system that is more democratic, more people-centered, and directly accessible to a fair energy system, again, which emphasizes the role of communities. Another CAN position there that talks about this rapid clean energy infrastructure. That's something very important that we're pushing at this COP, and we really think it's also important to think about it in a just way, because there are going to be people who are going to be left out, and this is, you know, we shouldn't leave anyone behind. If we're going to energy transition, there are jobs that are going to be lost. We need to think about those populations as well, jobs from the fossil fuel sector. So we really need a just, clean energy transition worldwide. And then the last one there is really talking about guardrails, protecting this rapid clean expansion for renewable energy infrastructure to make sure that we don't replicate the same outdated fossil fuel system that still exploits populations. And then this is a framework, a CAN position framework of how to actually achieve this. You can take a picture of that. It moves step by step from 1 to 7 around how we're promoting a just, equitable, and rapid transition to 100% renewable energy. And then these are our COP28 energy demands, our energy package. As you noticed, I'm sure it's news now, yesterday, our target for rapidly scaling up renewable energy, the tripling of renewable energy and doubling of energy efficiency target was announced yesterday, but we still think that it doesn't necessarily meet the targets for climate goals and climate ambitions. We really need to do better. So I'll just end there. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing the position of CAN International. You touched upon quite a lot of important points, especially the socio-economic benefits, but also I think one critical point which I think will be addressed in the rest of the presentations on the issue of mobilization at scale. What are the challenges in permitting and supply chains? And I think some of the questions will be answered by the rest of the presenters. So I'm pleased to invite next Dr. Irfan Mirza, who's the president of the World Wind Energy Association, to give the perspective about wind power development.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good evening. World Wind Energy Association has more than 600 members around 100 countries. So as we navigate the challenges of the rapidly changing world, we must remember that the decisions we make today will shape the energy landscape for generations to come. The wind energy has a profound role to play in mitigating climate change, reducing carbon emissions, and ensuring energy security. Since we all are together under the banner of REN Alliance today, so let's seize the opportunity, united in our purpose and driven by a shared commitment to a cleaner, greener future. So let me start my presentation, sir. Yeah, I'll use the green one. Yeah, thank you. As per the topic today, mainly the presentation is based on the data, just to show to you that how the wind energy is progressing. If we see the exponential curve, so the electricity generated is around 1800 terawatt hours, which is around approximately 8% share in the global electricity demand. The cumulative world wind power capacity worldwide is, by the end of 2022, is approximately 934,000 megawatts. The annual growth rates, if you see the annual growth rates, you'll see in the percentage they are going down. But in reality, the wind power is increasing, but it is because the base. Since the base is increasing, so it looks in a percentage it is getting down. In the coming slides, I'll show and explain this to you. But I purposely put this slide here so that this is a question most of the time that the wind power annual growth rates are going down. So actually, in percentage wise, it is going down, but in reality, it is going up. So wind power capacity by country at the end of 2022. You can see almost half the 40% or half the capacity is from China. So rest of the world is as small as United States, and then Germany, India, Spain, Brazil, France. So these are the notable names here. Wind power capacity added in 2022. So no surprises here. China again, and then the rest of the world. United States is also doing well, and then Brazil, United Kingdom, Germany, India. See. So this is the global installed wind power capacity in megawatts. If you see, every year the capacity is increasing, and we are now approximately 1 million megawatt capacity at this point in time. These are the annual additional capacities. If you see from 2011, or if for a decade, you see if in 2013, and now in 2023, this is what it linked to that graph which I was telling, that every year the capacity is increasing, but in percentage sense, it looks a little less because the base is increasing every year. So these are the capacities from December 20 to December 2023. The predicted values is that You can see the chart again, China, United States, Germany. This is almost the same pattern going on. What we expect at WWEA, that the long-term role of the wind power would be around 40 to 50% of the global power supply. And this is from REN 21, more renewable power added than fossil fuel and nuclear. I'm talking about the last decade from 2010 to 2020. If you see that the share of the renewable is definitely more than the share of the fossil fuels and the nuclear. Okay, this is all about wind energy, but the new system is decentralized and renewable. Previously, we from the CAN, it was also said that the community power and we need to. So similarly, we think that the decentralized power is the source. And these days, in the COP, if you go to the Saudi stall and the Master stall and others, so they will tell you that the hydrogen is not far behind and the hydrogen is coming, and they have actually developed engines running on hydrogen and things like that. So basically, this, if we get hydrogen into the mix instead of the storage, so I think renewables have a lot bigger future. And definitely whatever we do, it has to be socially inclusive as well. Now coming to the bottlenecks, there are two types of bottlenecks. One bottleneck is in relation to the planning processes of wind farms. And the second bottleneck, which I haven't mentioned here on the slide, but I just wanted to talk about it, is not that important in, for example, in Europe or in US, but for countries like us, that is important. That is a technical challenge. The technical challenge is also, before I come to this bottleneck of planning and processes, I just wanted to highlight, because that was not there in the presentation. That is not there in the presentation. That is a technical challenge. The technical challenge of the grid, actually. It is very difficult because the countries like ours, like I'm talking about the developing and underdeveloped countries, the grid is always very weak. So, and grids are not interconnected as well. For example, in Europe, if you have excess wind power, it can go to anywhere from Germany to any other country where it is required. But our grids are not interconnected grids, number one. And number two, they are very weak grids. So in a weak grid, which is not interconnected with any other country, it is always, so we cannot take more than 10, 15, 20% of the, so we have to at least improve the grid system, which most of the countries are doing right now, to get more renewable energy. Now the other bottleneck, which is actually a bottleneck everywhere, which is very less talked about, that is the planning processes. So the global average duration is 62 months for planning process and 29 months for permitting process. This is a list. This is what we do. We gather data. We put that in a way which people can understand and can analyze. So these are the countries from minimum to maximum, and then we put a planning index. For example, lesser time in Ukraine, but if you see, for example, Italy, 48 months to 96 months. Mongolia, 60 months to 120. And then the permitting, if you see permitting, again, for example, countries like Japan, 48 months to 72 months, the index is 80. So this is the kind of a impediment which needs to be improved. So these are some kind of recommendations from our side. The permitting process should not take longer than 12 months. Also strengthening social support for wind power by fostering models which maximize the local share of economic and social benefits. This is also very important. local communities, municipalities and citizens, local involvement in the planning process and local co-ownership of the wind farms are important instruments to achieve not only high local acceptance but local support also. Most of the time the wind farms, wind is at areas where generally, if I'm not talking about Europe in particular, but in other countries, where we might have less population and where we might have people who are not, we are going to use their lands, but how they are going to be benefited. Even in Europe also, this is going to be a serious issue, the community, how to support communities. So this is very much, and I'm going to touch that in my next slide. But before that, one last recommendation is that each country should set up a monitoring process which assess the wind power planning and permit, because we need to somehow improve that. So community energy on the global agenda. This is the most important thing which we are actually at WWEA. We firmly believe that the transition to a sustainable energy future cannot be achieved in isolation. It requires a collective effort that includes communities as active participants and beneficiaries as well. Being participant is not that important. It is important, but at the same time, they need to be beneficiaries as well. So these are some work which we do with ARENA on community energy, showcasing WWEA here. We are also working with 100% renewables. This is our new motto, go100re.net. And Symphony of the Renewables was our conference in Australia. That was the title, because it's not only wind energy, but we want, very recently we have World Wind Energy Conference 2023 in Australia, Hobart, and the title was Symphony of Renewables. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Irfan, for sharing perspectives from wind power. And just to put things into context, I think what he showed is when you consider planning and permitting, and the average was what, like 5 to 7 years or so. And if you look at all the announcements that have been made of tripling capacity by 2030, if we still have the same time for permitting and planning, we need to plan today or yesterday for all those capacities to come online by 2030. So it's a big challenge. There's a lot of work to do. So thanks for sharing that perspective. And next, usually when you hear of renewable technologies, you hear wind, it inevitably follows solar, or it's usually solar and wind or wind and solar. So I'm pleased to invite next Dr. Dave Rene from the International Solar Energy Society.
Thank you, Bharadwaj. You're going to see that we all coordinated our slides, preparations very closely here. Let's see. Do they load them up? Oh, yes. Well, we're already one ahead. There we go. So, yeah, let's talk about solar energy now. Solar and wind have for years been in a friendly competition, it seems like, but it's a good competition because it's really helped drive costs down for both of these technologies. So, of course, this is what we're all facing. This is a slide I made about 4 months ago. Since then, we've learned that most likely, or it's very highly likely now, that 2023 is going to be the warmest year ever recorded in human history, and potentially the warmest year in the last over 100,000 years. I don't know if we're going to be able to confirm that kind of a detail, but this is what we're looking at in terms of the challenge. And we have a limited remaining carbon budget that can be put back, that can still be put into the atmosphere if we don't want to go beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade, and that's about 600 to 800 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And in fact, that number is now viewed to be maybe a little bit high as an estimate. So you've seen this chart. This is one that I found just the other day from Climate Analytics, but this is a chart that is shown quite often in different ways by a number of different organizations. We're hearing now that it's possible that in terms of total fossil fuel or greenhouse gas emission reductions, we may be close to peaking that level, possibly even this year, but certainly within the next 3 to 5 years, and especially if we can get the Paris Climate Agreement nationally determined contributions to really start working, which in many cases it appears they are. Climate Analytics looked at 3 different scenarios, and you see this in a number of other studies as well. The red line is a baseline or kind of a business as usual scenario. The yellow line is a low effort, and the green line is if we continue to accelerate the pace of cleaning up the energy system through negotiations such as what we're seeing here in the COPs and the Paris Agreement. So 2023 is a potential peak for our greenhouse gas emissions based on the great work that's been done up to now, but a lot more has to still be done if we're going to maintain or keep below 1.5 degrees centigrade. There we go. So you saw this for wind. Here it is for solar. Globally installed PV capacity exceeded 1 terawatt in the first half of 2022. We didn't have a big celebration. We probably should have, but we'll have one when we get to 1.5 or maybe 2 terawatts. I understand the wind people are going to celebrate their 1 terawatt milestone here. But you can see that the markets are primarily in China, the red line. The yellow line is the Asia-Pacific region. The blue line, a little hard to see, is the U.S., North America. And the gray bar at the bottom is Europe. So those are the 4 major markets for PV. We really like to see that market spread more geographically around the world. And I think it's going to happen especially in Africa and even more so in the Asia-Pacific region over the next few years. And 45% more PV was installed in 2022 than was installed in 2021. So clearly, we are really accelerating the pace of photovoltaic installments around the world. And you can see this in another way. This is from the Solar Power Europe Global Market Outlook. From last year in 2022, you can see that we added 302 gigawatts of renewable power to the system around the world. The yellow line represents solar, which I think is a little bit larger than the blue line, which represents wind, but it's pretty close. But in 2022, we added 362 gigawatts, another 20% more than 2021, and the pace of the solar has actually increased between 2022 and 2021. So you can see that these 2 technologies are really dominating new power supply additions around the world. And if you look over the next 5 years, again, this is from the Global Market Outlook that Solar Power Europe publishes every year. They usually look at 2 different scenarios, and the red line is sort of their best estimate, although they have noted in their report this year that they have actually been above their best estimate line over the last few years. So the projections that are being developed even by organizations like Solar Power Europe are turning out to be conservative. And as you've heard, projections from other intergovernmental organizations like the IEA have been lower and have been beaten even more so over the last decade or so in terms of growth. So I just did some calculations looking at 2 different types of scenarios. You talked about the Coalition for Action, and there's another working group in the Coalition for Action called the Towards 100% Renewable Energy. And we're in the process of putting together a policy brief that will probably be coming out sometime next year. But if you'd like to hear something about it, if you can come over to the Irina Pavilion on Tuesday, I think it's at 10 o'clock, there will be a panel of people talking about a policy brief that's looking at various different 100% renewable energy scenarios, comparing them against net zero scenarios. And there's a big difference. There's an important difference between net zero, which is what several organizations like IRENA, IEA, and I have another study here from Bloomberg that allows still for fossil fuel production to exist in 2050. In other words, the net zero studies are getting to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, which is what the scientists say we have to do in order to keep below 1.5 degrees centigrade. But the net zero means that it still allows for carbon use or carbon emissions as long as there's an equitable carbon removal procedure in the atmosphere. However, as of this time, those removal procedures are still very expensive. If you look at the amount of carbon that could be taken out of the atmosphere compared to what could be, the cost of that compared to what could be done with more renewables, the 100% renewable energy scenarios, which assume that we've finished with fossil fuels completely by 2050, are the lower cost option, and that's part of what we'll be talking about on Tuesday. And just from a solar perspective, I looked at these 6 different reports and came up with these kinds of numbers. I don't want to go into details now. I don't think we have time to talk about this too much, but you can see that even conservative estimates will show that will be well over 14 terawatts, 15 terawatts, maybe even 20 terawatts, even under net zero scenarios by 2050. And that's compared to, as I said, a little over 1 terawatt today. So the whole concept of triple up and double down, which you're hearing a lot about these days, this is what the Global Renewables Alliance is promoting as a target for the next rest of this decade, is certainly within the realm of what we need to be doing anyway to get to net zero or to get to 100% renewables by 2050. So the market opportunities for these technologies continues to be very strong. The growth rates required to get to these numbers are not as high as the current growth rate we're experiencing. So, and there are many key emerging opportunities which we can talk about quickly here. You've heard about some of these, I'm sure. Agrivoltaics, that's where we combine photovoltaics with agricultural practices so we can maximize the use of both technologies. Floating photovoltaics, putting large arrays of photovoltaic systems on water bodies. Storage capacity is very critical with solar, of course, for all solar durations, for all time durations. We're focusing a lot these days on battery storage, but we really need to be focusing on long duration energy storage for solar, as well as some of the other technologies. Distributed rooftop PV is still a very strong concept, it's pushed very strongly in many countries. And there are ways to show how it does increase grid flexibility when managed properly by the utility. And you hear a lot about sector coupling. This is where if you have excess PV, instead of curtailing it, which is often done by utilities these days, you can use that excess when you don't really need it to provide other services like thermal storage or thermal applications or power to various gas applications, green hydrogen, and even passive solar building energy performance. We can take much more advantage of the sun than we are currently been doing to improve building efficiency. So the key barriers, you're going to see the same list I'm sure that you've already seen, but supply chain and trade issues is of course very significant right now for the PV industry. And again, the regulatory processes, I'm glad you gave the statistics that you did. Grid scale PV tends to be lower cost than rooftop PV, and part of that is because of the regulatory process and the approval process, even just to get a rooftop solar system installed in certain countries. In the US, for example, rooftop solar costs are substantially higher than they are in Europe, largely due to longer regulatory processes, more steps that have to be done. It's all for a good reason, of course, for safety and for reliability purposes, but we really do need to find a way to become much more efficient in that process. A lot of concerns about recycling or reusing old solar panels. We've had a number of systems that have been up for 20 or 30 years and they're still working quite well. But the reality is after 30 years or so, and even sooner, we're going to be having to remove old systems and replace them with newer systems and therefore dispose of the older systems. And so that's a big concern, but we've got a lot of progress being done in that area. I guess another pitch for a side event is, I think it's tomorrow, the ISA is holding a side event on PV recycling tomorrow afternoon, which if you're interested in this topic, please come to hear that at the ISA Solar Hub Pavilion. Energy justice, of course, is always an issue for changing technologies or for transitioning energy system, job displacement and reskilling issues, not in my backyard issues. You hear a lot about that, especially for large-scale projects. PV access is possible in all economic and demographic regions, but in some areas it's not as accessible or it's not as promoted as much as it could be. And community power access, I think, this is a very important topic. We can certainly get into that in a lot of detail, but I think this is something that the REN Alliance going forward is going to be really pushing a lot of information on. Again, Coalition for Action is also working in this area. But how do people who live in rental apartments or apartment buildings and don't have their own roof be able to share or participate in the energy transformation? And community power programs are really a very important way to make that happen. And then quickly, PV working with other technologies. I already mentioned some of these, but you'll see a lot of microgrids and mini grids being developed, especially in various places around the world, even in the developed world, which consist of wind, maybe, and solar, perhaps in some cases even geothermal technologies, and of course storage. As I mentioned before, power to X and green hydrogen, high temperature solar thermal applications. We can't forget the solar thermal community. It's still has an important role to play, especially in high temperature applications, and in many areas around the world it's still very important and very cost effective for solar water heating applications at the residential level. So that's still a key solar technology that we don't want to neglect. And load matching opportunities between wind and solar to add to grid flexibility and stability. Thank you for your participation.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave, for sharing the perspective on solar power and also sticking to the script, talking about data markets and how there are very good examples of renewable, one or two or more renewables working together as well. So thanks for sharing that. And I then move on to the next presenter. That would be Dr. Christian Rakos from the World Bioenergy Association. So Christian.
Many thanks. Yes, I would like to talk about the role of bioenergy in this context of renewable energies working together for the transition to a sustainable energy supply system. Just a few words about the World Bioenergy Association. Like our colleagues, we are a membership organization, an association of associations, but also of industries. And our mission is to promote the sustainable use of bioenergy. I would like to start with this graph from the International Energy Agency. The net zero scenario was mentioned, but the interesting thing is to not only see all these hypothetical lines going down, but also what's the composition of the next energy system, what's the composition. And what you can see is, and that is interesting, there are three big contributors. That's solar, bioenergy, and wind. And all three of them will be approximately in the same size, then followed by nuclear, but still at a lower level. So we have to say that solar, wind, and bioenergy will have the role of oil, gas, and coal in the future. We will be really big, and that means there is really huge opportunities also. Now you may ask, bioenergy is not very often mentioned. Usually it's whenever there is talk about renewable energies, there is mostly solar and wind. Hydro is already often forgotten, and bioenergy definitely also. So why is the role so prominent in this scenario, even the second largest renewable energy source? And there are a few reasons for that. One is it's available in very large quantities. If you look at the amount of biomass that is generated year for year on the world, it's more than 10 times as much as the human turnover of energy. So it is available in very large quantities. It is a local fuel. This is a picture from India, by the way, where you see a truck unloading briquettes to a big factory that needs steam for its processes in the pharmaceutical industry. So it can be sourced almost everywhere around the world. It's a local fuel. It's not like with oil and gas that have to be shipped from far away. And one of the main reasons why bioenergy is projected to have an important role is that it can supply a variety of different fuels. It can supply solid fuel, it can supply gaseous fuel, biomethane, it can supply liquid fuels. And our energy system does not only consist of electricity. A big part of our energy system is traffic fuels, a big part is heat that is needed for domestic applications like cooking and heating, but also for a lot of industrial applications. And that is why bioenergy plays an important role. Also, and that is also very often overlooked, it's a very cheap way of storing renewable energy. If you compare, for example, this big battery storage, 5 megawatt hours, costs a hell of a lot of money. And if you think about biomass, pellets stored in a couple of bags, there is 6 orders of magnitude lower cost to store that energy. That is a lot. That is a big difference. And that is something that is very often overlooked. We are happily talking about storing energy and doing batteries, but this is a way to store energy in a very efficient way, especially when it comes to heat demand. Heat demand is a very concentrated demand. You need for cooking, you need 2 kilowatts for a very short period of time in the day, maybe for 2 hours, 1 hour for lunchtime, 1 for dinner. And that creates a heavy stress on networks. And that's why bioenergy kicks in. Making a cook stove with 1 or 2 kilowatts is no problem. It costs $50 and you put a couple of pellets in, half a kilo, and you can cook for an hour. So that's why it is important and why it will have a role. And it is affordable. This is a graph that shows you the cost of energy delivered for cooking in Africa, in Kampala. These are real numbers. These are not fictitious numbers that we collected in this city. And what you can say is, assuming that pellets would be part of the game at a price of $150 to $250 per ton, which is current world market prices, they would be half as expensive as charcoal. LPG would be 3 times as expensive and electricity 4 times as expensive to cook the same meal. And that's why I believe and why we are really engaged as WBA to promote modern bioenergy cooking. So what that is, we call it green cooking. It means using advanced combustion technology, gasification stoves, like as I said, it's not a big deal, $50 per stove, and densified biomass, pellets that can be made of almost any agricultural residues, whether it is straw, it is rice husks, whether it is sugarcane bagasse. There are so many resources, nut shells, peanut shells. All of these resources, if you process them, they become a much better fuel than the raw biomass, and they can be used for this purpose. So the question is, what are the barriers for accelerated deployment of modern bioenergy? They are different than the ones my colleagues mentioned. In Europe, we have seen a lot of campaigning against bioenergy use, which was kind of something that we did not expect at all, and it was really kind of upsetting. And a lot of this campaigning is based on a misunderstanding of the role of carbon cycles. Because if you argue that CO2 is coming out of this chimney, that still doesn't mean that it is emitting net CO2, because if the same amount of CO2 is absorbed before by the plant, there is no net addition of CO2 to the atmosphere. But that has been an argument that has over and over been repeated against the use of bioenergy. Also, the misconception that modern bioenergy is very polluting, it's very inefficient like traditional bioenergy. But this is not the case. It is very efficient and it's very clean. It can be done very clean if it's done properly. We see also a heavy promotion, especially in Africa actually, of the transition from traditional biomass to use of fossil energy. This is also deplorable. There was an article in The Guardian just a few days ago that was looking at the policies of Middle East countries to hook Africa on fossil fuels, partly by promoting LPG for cooking, which is, as I showed you, it's 3 times as expensive than bioenergy, and it simply drains resources out of Africa towards Dubai, I guess. So I don't think it's a good idea. And finally, one barrier that we are really having in this transition from traditional bioenergy to modern bioenergy is that there is kind of a chicken and egg problem. As long as there is no market for processed, densified biomass, upgraded biomass, there is no investment. But if there is no investment, no market is developing. And that kind of is perpetuating a situation where most of the biomass is used in a traditional way, and there is no progress. So that is our mission as WBA, to change that, and we're really eager to make a contribution for that. So we do that by transferring know-how, by establishing contacts. We have published the website Pro Pellets Africa most recently to make available the know-how that is necessary to develop these projects. We have webinars with a global outreach. I think people from over 100 countries have attended our webinars. And we try to support capacity building for modern bioenergy use. So, in case you're active in the bioenergy sphere, become a member. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Christian, for sharing perspectives from bioenergy. And it's one of the most annoying things as a moderator is to hold up signs saying, you know, you're over your time. But I'm very glad all of you stuck to your scheduled speaking time. So that means that we'll have quite a lot of time for questions and discussions afterwards. So keep your questions ready, because we have one final presenter, Debbie Gray from the International Hydropower Association, and I'm actually very interested and look forward to your presentation because of the work done on, especially on sustainability by IHA. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm last, but I'm certainly not least, because hydropower has been called by Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, as the forgotten giant of the renewables. Perhaps because it's been around for 100 years. Hydroelectricity today makes up actually more than other renewables in terms of electricity generation. Not that I'm bragging, but what I will be doing tonight is, it's been interesting listening to my co-panelists because we've each touched on common themes and also brought new elements into it. So I guess the element that I'm going to focus in most strongly tonight is about sustainability. And that probably reflects the fact that hydropower has been around for a long time, and I will admit has had issues with sustainability in the past. But let me first tell you who I am and where I come from. So the IHA, the International Hydropower Association, is an industry association which has now actually, we just hit our 100-member mark a couple of weeks ago. They're members who are active in the hydropower industry. So we're talking about operators as well as consultants and equipment manufacturers. And our mission is really to advance sustainable hydropower. We've moved from a membership-based only association to a values-based association. So we require all of our members to commit to this notion of sustainability, and I'm going to come to how we define that a little bit later on. And what we want to do is we want to promote the use of hydropower, and really by engaging with policymakers, coming to occasions like COP28 to remind, to get the message out there that if we're going to meet our net zero goals, we are going to need more hydropower. Just an overview of some of our members. As you see, we are global, and our members represent, I believe it is, 1/3 of the installed hydropower capacity in the world. Moving on now. So now you might be thinking, well, of course I'm going to say we need more hydropower because I just told you I work for the International Hydropower Association, and part of our mission is to promote the use of hydropower. But it's actually not just the IHA who is saying that we need more hydropower. It's interesting that we've all presented different graphs or different forms of projections into the future. What do we need to do to get to net zero? So I'm going to present a graph, which I don't think we've seen tonight. This is modeling, actually this one was done by Irina, but it is very similar to what was done by the IEA. So what I'm looking at here is not the energy mix, it's really the electricity mix. And what I want you to have a look at, there are two things that I want to mention about this graph. First of all, we're looking at 2017 on the left and then 2050 on the right. What's really obvious, I think, is that the bar at 2050 is 2.5 or about 3 times as large as the bar on the left. Why is that? Because we're going to need more electricity to meet our net zero goals. We're talking about getting rid of fossil fuels in the entire energy mix. That means electrifying things like transportation with more electric vehicles, buildings in terms of heating systems in northern climates like Canada, where I am from. That's a large part of our energy use actually is in heating of buildings, as well as in industrial processes. So we're talking about a lot of electrification, which is why, of course, the bar in 2050 is so much larger than the bar in 2017. Now, if we're looking at the composition, so what will our electricity kilowatt hour come from looking at 2050 in this -2 degrees or less than 2 degree scenario? Of course, we see massive increase in solar, massive increase in wind, as well as some geothermal and other, you can read all the composition of the kilowatt hour, but of course I'm talking about hydro. So if we look at the blue bar, which is just circled by red, you will see, it's hard to see with this scale actually, but actually we need to double hydropower by 2050 if we're going to meet our next zero goals. Now, why is it? Why am I insisting so much on hydropower? Can't we just do it all with wind and solar? Everyone loves wind and solar, and we have got batteries. Well, we need hydropower because wind and solar are great, but they are intermittent. So when the sun doesn't shine in the middle of the night, obviously, or the wind doesn't blow, we need something else to back it up. And I know there's a lot of buzz about batteries, and can't we do it all with batteries? And batteries certainly have a role for short duration storage. One of my colleagues, I can't remember which one, was talking about long duration storage. Well, we don't have to wait for the next best long duration storage technology because we have one which has been around for about 50 years now and works really well and has been quite optimized. That's called pumped storage hydropower. Pumped storage hydropower is basically you have an upper reservoir and a lower reservoir. In times of excess generation, for example, in a sunny climate like Australia, which might have a lot of sun, and in the middle of the day, where there's perhaps not a lot of demand, there's excess solar capacity. Well, instead of curtailing that capacity, you can just pump the water up a hill, and then when the sun goes down, the water comes back down the hill, turns the turbines, and then you have electricity. So it's a giant water battery, and we're not talking about hours of storage, we can talking about days and even weeks and even months of storage, depending on the scale. So that's why we're going to need more hydropower, because hydropower also provides a number of ancillary services which keep the grid, which allow the flexibility to allow the intermittent renewables to penetrate more. Now, again, a lot of people have said, yes, but hydropower has been around for a long time. Haven't like the best sites already been taken and hydropower has already been built? That is not exactly true, even in continents like Europe, where that argument comes up quite a lot. We did a literature review 2 years ago in a report, which more or less, the title of which is, the next 850 gigawatts, where are we going to get it? And in every single continent, there is still a lot of untapped potential. However, hydropower, we're at a little bit of a crossroads because some people don't even consider hydropower to be renewable, believe it or not, because they say, well, it's not a good renewable, it's not a good part of the solution moving forward because of the environmental impact that it has. And it's true that there have been some very large projects done in the past which would not be done today because they were not done sustainability. And as you can see in this image here, there have been people out there protesting against hydropower projects. That being said, there were also situations where people protest against wind and people protest against solar. So there is a lot of not in my backyard or NIMBYism. It's not unique to the hydropower sector. Which is why the International Hydropower Association has worked over the past 15, almost 20 years now, since the World Commission on Dams report, which came out just over 20 years ago, to really look at this notion of sustainability and to develop a number of sustainability tools and a number of best practices. From those best practices became a number of assessment tools, and 2 years ago we launched those tools into what we call the Hydropower Sustainability Standard. Very recently, just 1 month ago at our World Hydropower Congress, the guardians of the standard actually spun off into its own group called the Hydropower Sustainability Alliance. So if the QR code leads to their newly launched website there. So the Hydropower Sustainability Alliance is basically the guardians of a hydropower sustainability standard, which, like any standard, is a way of measuring how good the project is in terms of sustainability. So as mentioned, hydro does have a vital role to play in the transition to a low-carbon economy to support the penetration of wind and solar. However, irresponsible projects are no longer acceptable. The solution to that, so how can an investor know if a project is a good project or not? How can communities trust a hydropower developer who might want to develop a project on their site? How can developers address the complex environmental, social, and governance issues? And how can governments be sure that they're approving in the permitting process, that they're approving a good project? Well, the answer is that we need a standard, and that is exactly what was developed. And the standard that we developed was not developed by, for, and by the hydropower industry. It was done in conjunction with a number of stakeholders, including international finance institutions such as the World Bank, including NGOs, including environmental NGOs like IUCN and WWF. And the standard has also now become recognized in certain lenders. Like, for example, the Climate Bonds Initiative provides funding to low climate projects, and they will provide funding to new hydropower projects as long as one of the sustainability tools has been applied and if the project now passes the minimum requirements of the sustainability tools. So that's one example of how sustainability can really make or break a project now. What does the standard cover? It covers these 12 issues that you see on the slide, so I'll just let you have a look at those. But what I want to emphasize with this is that when we're talking about sustainability, we're not just talking about biodiversity and land impacts, we're also talking about community impacts, and we're talking about indigenous issues as well as cultural heritage, for example. And the members of the International Hydropower Association pledged 2 years ago a no-go commitment in UNESCO World Heritage Zones. The process to get a project certified is a transparent, independent process. So there are 4 steps to it that you see here. First of all, the assessment is done by a third-party assessor. It's not done by IHA, and it's not done by the company itself. It's done by a certified third-party assessor. The results are open to all stakeholders. I think this is fairly unique with our standard in that once the initial report is done, it has to be made available for 60 days for comment, and has to be made available in such a manner which is accessible to the local population. And if that means most likely translating the report into the local language and making it accessible, not just putting it and hiding it on a website somewhere, but having town hall meetings and having paper copies of the report accessible, if that is the best way to get the information out to the local community. And then the local community and any other stakeholder actually has a chance to reply or to submit comments on it. Quality insurance, there's a quality insurance step which is done by the Sustainability Alliance Secretariat. And finally, there's this multi-stakeholder oversight, which I mentioned earlier. Finally, one aspect of sustainability, which is perhaps lesser known, which is why I want to tackle it head on, is the fact of greenhouse gas emissions from reservoirs. When land is flooded to generate a reservoir, be it a hydroelectric reservoir or a drinking water reservoir, incidentally, the flooded soil, the carbon in the soil, the flooded soil, decomposes to form either CO2, carbon dioxide, or CH4, methane. And in certain site-specific areas, in certain circumstances, there can actually be a significant and immeasurable amount of methane. So the IHA has worked with some scientific partners to develop a tool called the GRES tool. And what this does is a simple-to-use web-based tool which allows a developer to input the parameters of their project in order to evaluate what will be the level of emissions of a future project or even of an existing project. Finally, and this is my last slide, this is the Bali Statement, which touches on some of the, not so much the barriers, but more the solutions, which address the barriers, and a lot of these are common with the other renewable energy fields. First of all, why am I talking about a Bali Statement? Well, because we had our World Hydropower Congress exactly 1 month ago today in Bali, Indonesia. So out of that came the Bali Statement about powering sustainable growth, talking about how wind, water, and sun together will power the sustainable growth of the future. And there are 4 specific recommendations to policymakers. Planning for future energy needs. We heard about permitting. And that's the number 3. If I'm talking about doubling hydropower between now and 2050, I'm talking about building as much hydropower in the next 25 years or so as we have built in the previous 100 years. So just take a second to think about that. It's taken 100 years for us to get to the, can't remember off the top of my head, the gigawatts that we're at now of installed capacity. We're going to have to do the equivalent of that in the next 25 years. So we have to start thinking about it now, because we're talking about, one of my colleagues mentioned, I think the wind, it takes 5 years to permit, but it probably only takes 2-3 years to build. A hydropower plant from start to finish, including the permitting process, takes anywhere from 10 to 15 years. So plan for future energy needs now. That's number 1. Incentivize sustainable hydropower development through financial aid and market-based mechanisms. Most electricity markets now only reward energy, so you get paid by kilowatt hour. However, for grids to be stable, they need what's called ancillary services, which is a complicated notion. I'm not going to get into it right now. It's certainly not my specialty, but basically it's electricity which has to be ready to go. It has to be dispatchable, has to be ready to go the minute that the grid needs it, or else the grid will, the frequency will, it's called frequency control and voltage control. So there are all these technical services called ancillary services, which hydroelectricity can provide. And in markets which don't have a lot of hydro, for example, or a lot of what's called spinning reserve, often those services are provided by gas turbines or gas peakers. Accelerate the development of all renewables through transparent and efficient permitting and licensing processes. I think each one of us has addressed or has spoken a little bit about permitting processes and how we have to accelerate those. Finally, incorporate sustainability practices into government regulation and the financial sector obligation, so that they can be harmonized and that we're sure that only sustainable projects go ahead. I said that was my last slide because I forgot. I threw in an extra slide about renewables working together. So hydropower, including pump storage, which I mentioned earlier, can store energy and back up the intermittent renewables, solar, wind, for example. And here's another example of floating solar with a photo. This floating solar plant was inaugurated by President Jokowi of Indonesia at the Serata hydropower plant just a few weeks ago, and it's actually the largest floating solar power plant in Southeast Asia. So this is a good example of actually the synergies between hydropower and other renewables, because at a hydropower plant, of course, you have all the electrical equipment and the grid connections already there. So this floating solar, the solar plant does not need to rebuild those. They can just plug into the existing electrical infrastructure. As well, apparently, I'm not a solar PV panel expert by any means. My colleagues can help me with this. But the fact that the solar panels are floating on water, the water actually keeps them cool. And when a PV panel is cool, it's actually more efficient. So there's a really big win-win situation here. And this is now my final slide. So thank you very much. Get involved if you want to learn more about the International Hydropower Association, any of the tools or any of the how-to guides and the best practice guidelines we put together. Please come visit our website or come and see me after. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing the perspectives from hydropower. I think you mentioned, what was Dr. Fatih mentioned, was that overlooked giant of renewables? And I think forgotten giant. I think bioenergy was the overlooked giant. They do use a lot of verbs to mention renewables, but it's good that they talk a lot about renewables these days. So thank you. Thanks for that perspective. So yes, now we are at the end of presentations. We still have about 15-20 minutes or so. The floor is open for any questions. One, two.
Hello, my name is Tian Liu. I'm from China, the Harvard Institute of Technology, Shenzhen. My question is about the hydro energy. Hydro energy is why, I think you know that China has maybe one of the largest hydropower projects, like maybe the three golden dams, right? So, and however, it's still some concern about the economic impacts, not economic, the ecological impacts about this large hydropower projects. And you see that, especially the long-term impact, that we can hardly calculate it or just to get some evidence about it. So have you considered any or the future plan about the large hydropower project? For example, that do you support the larger hydropower project or just the mid-size or the small size of this hydropower project? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Is this working? So we don't differentiate between large, small, or medium hydropower. In terms, what we promote is sustainable hydropower. And it's interesting you bring up that question of large versus small, because some large hydropower projects, large in terms of megawatts, for example, which might be in a V dam, actually have a much higher power density. That is, that they flood less land per installed capacity than lots of small or medium. And a badly sited small hydropower project, which, for example, on a river which might have a migrating fish species, where there is no fish passage put into place, might actually be more damaging than a large hydropower project, which might be built, for example, next to a waterfall, where there's no fish passage anyhow. So no, we don't differentiate between large, small. We differentiate between sustainable and not sustainable, and how do we measure the sustainability through the sustainability standard.
And also, how can you measure the ecological impact of these hydropower projects?
Well, there's a whole section on biodiversity, and without going into the details, perhaps we can talk after, but without going into the details, the general steps are looking at, okay, what is the baseline? What are the species that are living there, both on the land and in the water? What is the baseline, and what will be the impact if there is flooding? There seems to be and how will it change, for example, patterns in terms of spawning, in terms of passage, again, for migratory species. But there seems to be a misnomer that when you dam a river, you kill the river. Actually, that's not true. What we have found, and I'm talking about my personal experience, I used to work for Hydro-Quebec, a major hydropower producer in Canada. There's actually a bit of a baby boom after the reservoir is created, because the flooding of the land causes more organic material to become available to fish species, and then so there's a boom, and then the fish population comes down to an equilibrium. So a reservoir is not dead, but it is a changed environment. It is absolutely a changed environment, but that does not mean that it's dead. So it's looking at the specific species that are there. And that's one thing I think about hydropower, is it's very site-specific. You cannot look at a project done in one part of the world or in one particular river and say, well, this had a bad impact on this fish species, therefore all hydropower projects are going to have a bad impact on fish species. There really is site-specific, which is why there is such a need to do the environmental studies and the baseline studies before, and then put into place mitigation measures and follow-up measures to make sure the mitigation measures are working.
Hi everyone, my name is Forrest and I'm a student at Indiana University. So you all showed graphs showing the need for increase in your specific energy technology, and a lot of that's going to have to be done in the developing world. So I was wondering what can be done to get investment in large projects in your expertise energy system, both from policymakers in those developing countries, and then what can financiers do to add more finance to build more projects. Thank you.
Thank you. I think one of the most pertinent questions. Why I raised hand? Because I think this is the issue mainly in the developing countries. Oh, thank you. Love you. So, it all depends on a lot of things, for example. The first and the foremost thing is the clarity of the policy and the regulations. The second most important thing is your contractual documents. Because, for example, all big projects are going to be financed by the lenders. For example, if I go and wanted to buy a car, there are so many signatures even I don't see and sign. For example, but if there is a project which is the life, if for example a lender is lending for 20 years or 15 years or whatever X number of years, so definitely he would like to see each and every possible scenario what is going to happen in future. So whoever is in the helm of the affairs within the policymakers or the government, so they have to develop the documents which have the buy-in for the lenders. This is the most important. Then the overall condition of the country. Let me give you an example. This is a very important project question, so this example would help actually. In Pakistan, for the last 20 years, we never faulted on a payment. Whatever we have to pay, we pay. Last 1 year, some smart people come and they think we need to renegotiate. People don't like that. So when they started renegotiating things, all the documents, lenders, everything has, I'm talking about a running project. So what that does is, it hampers your credibility for the future projects. And suddenly the lender who would be, for example, able to lend you on, for example, cipher plus X%, suddenly, because for a private sector or a lender, every risk has a dollar value. It is not that, for example, if you want to do a project in some area which you can't go, they will do the project, but every risk has a dollar value. So the example is, for example, every credibility also. So the country credibility does matter. For example, in a big project, in IPP mood, so it means they have to see whether whoever is the utility is going to pay or not. In countries like us, most of the time the countries are government owned. So that is why at the back end the government credibility comes in also. So I hope I try to answer them. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank the panelists for a range of very interesting presentations. I missed the first one, unfortunately, but they show that everybody's working in synergy, and there's a lot of opportunities linking everybody together. So I'd like to ask one question, and then a second one is very speculative, but I will give some background. But before doing that, I want to introduce myself briefly. I'm the founder and director of an organization called MEER, M-E-E-R. It stands for Mirrors for Earth's Energy Rebalancing. So we're developing durable surface-based reflectors to enable local adaptation, like cooling down homes without electricity, safeguarding water by floating mirrors on reservoirs, and also coupling them to agriculture to enable water saving and also improve yields for many species. So my general question is should be very simple. I'm a little confused by how much energy is actually produced. So there's installed gigawatt hours, and in different slides they disagree by a factor of 3, right? And the total electrical production, from my previous understanding, is between 2 and 3 terawatt in power units, not terawatt hours, 2 to 3 terawatt. But we just saw 7 terawatt in the presentation by the hydroelectric power specialist. So there is already a factor of 2 to 2.5 difference. And installed solar between the two sets of slides also differ by a factor of 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. So is it because we're using peak power in some cases rather than average generated power averaged over time? So that's the first question. It should be very easy to address because it's probably like a nomenclature convention. The second question or speculation is, there's one common future hurdle that I don't think the community understands. So as the world comes to the realization that carbon mitigation and capturing are not going to happen, it's just energetically not feasible and kinetically impossible, there's more and more talk of using solar radiation management by injecting pollution into the stratosphere to block some of the incoming solar light to reduce temperature that way. And we also realize that the locked-in warming from legacy emissions is sufficient to drive temperature rise of 4 degrees by the end of the century. So there is a paper by James Hansen published recently, and he was giving a remote talk today, this afternoon. So there's also big money in the military, US military, other countries, and also private money pushing for developing such technologies. Because if you have the control over a global thermostat, you can imagine how much power you would have. But that's not the main issue for you guys. The main issue for you guys is that when that happens, solar energy production will go down dramatically. So when you scatter, say, 2 or 3% of the light, your PV will decrease in efficiency proportionally to your photon flux. But for concentrating solar thermal, the impact will be higher because you change your direct irradiance into diffuse light. And estimates range between 10 to 20% reduction in concentrating solar thermal production when you have stratospheric aerosol injection. The impact on hydropower, I think, is a little bit less certain, right? Because you reduce incoming light, the rate of evaporation will reduce, but you also reduce evaporation. So the net balance in your reservoir may be somewhat less certain, but there will be globally divergent impact for sure. What I don't know is whether wind will be impacted, but presumably when you reduce the flux of energy, you reduce how much atmospheric instability there are, so wind energy could also be impacted, but I don't think there's research on that. So what I'm trying to say is that there's this, the prospect of doing this geoengineering high in the altitude that would inhibit the transition of the globe to renewable energies. And I wonder whether there's that sufficient, food for thought or create enough of worry that the community should come together and really investigate what would be the impact of that on renewable energy transition and whether we should counter that sort of, in my opinion, the ultimate hijacking of nature. So that's my comment and question.
Yeah.
I can try to take that. I think that's that second question on the worries of the effects of geoengineering on renewable energy supply are kind of hypothetical. First of all, geoengineering is still far away. And secondly, we're talking about growth factors that are ridiculously high and hardly to be achieved at all. And whether there is, we're talking about 5-fold, 10-fold, 40-fold increase of PV, and then we're discussing whether 10% or 20% reduction of electricity generation could be the effect of geoengineering. So I think we're talking about scales that are hardly possible to reach, and that is the first challenge I would like to think about rather than worrying about the geoengineering in 2060. And regarding the numbers, I think this is a private discussion. Yeah. This is, there is a lot of intricacy about renewable energy statistics that we would need to dive into, so I don't think we can handle this on the panel.
Yeah.
But perhaps just a quick part of it is, the figures that I presented were the -2 scenario, electricity only, whereas I think you probably presented energy as opposed to electricity. So the energy versus electricity, that's one source of divergence in the number, and another is if we're talking about net zero, if we're talking about -1.5 or -2. So those are two different, or 3 different factors to keep in mind when looking at our numbers.
Mine is just a small intervention. So what we really need now is a rapid, renewable energy clean infrastructure. So in my slide, I mentioned things like CCS and, dangerous disruption. So geoengineering is a dangerous disruption where we're trying all of these astronomical sort of, not even innovative, not even scalable, very far removed from anything we can achieve in the now, while fossil fuel phase out gets an extension because we're still trying to find out, these new energies of the future. Whereas renewables, solar, we also mentioned the different hydropower, we also mentioned bioenergy. These are things that have been tried and tested that we can sort of scale up and keep going with because they exist. So that's also sort of a dangerous distraction that we sort of need to avoid in the clean energy future we want. Yeah,
Thank you. The slides will be put up on CEORS, so if you come across any discrepancies in the data, you can get in touch with the speakers afterwards. One final quick question, 2 minutes.
Okay,
Sorry,
thank you.
everybody. Just a kind reminder that we have 3 minutes left until
Perfect.
the panel ends. Thank you.
They're pretty quick and specific. So regarding solar, you mentioned long-term duration storage. So if that's not battery, can you explain what that is for bioengineering or bio
Energy, yeah.
Can you explain how, and if it is not, how does that not contribute to degraded air quality and particulate matter? And then for hydropower, I have no idea where in the U.S. additional capacity would go because your chart showed it excluded pumped hydropower. So I guess you're talking about Canada and maybe Mexico, and this is probably a question you don't even need to answer because it's like I just can't imagine where additional capacity would be in the U.S. and I have some background in that. Okay.
Thank you. Very quick answers.
Yeah, I'll start
10
quickly
seconds.
on the long duration energy storage. We're talking about days, weeks, even seasonal storage. In other words, right now, most PV systems are going up with battery storage that involves like lithium-ion batteries that are used to provide a few hours of bridge power once the sun goes down or if it's a cloudy period. However, when we have so much solar in the summertime and we need so much energy in the wintertime, we need other types of storage. And I think hydro is a very good one. Pumped hydro is a very good one if you have the right conditions for it. It's not going to work everywhere, but it's going to be one solution to that. And then there's other more exotic storage systems, thermal storage. There's a lot of studies being done on thermal storage to at least give you a few days of additional energy supply when you don't have the sun. So the idea of long duration energy storage is it allows you to take advantage of those long periods of time when you have excess solar, and it doesn't all work on the grid. You have to just dump it or curtail it, as a polite way of saying it.
So very shortly on the particulate emissions, the fascinating thing is that with advanced technologies you can practically eliminate them entirely. A modern pellet boiler for heating in the northern hemisphere emits less than a cup of coffee of ash per year. So it's totally irrelevant. And a cook stove that's working with the gasifying principle, it produces a gas before it burns the gas, so it's almost as clean as LPG directly. And it's like a 98% reduction of particulate emissions. And at that level, they really are not very relevant anymore.
Regarding hydro in North America, yes, the slide was North America. A lot of the untapped capacity is in Canada. In the US, however, the US has something like 60,000 dams and only 3% are powered. So most of those are actually reservoirs for water reservoirs for other means. So powering non-powered dams is a huge issue in the US right now, like looking at, because the civil infrastructure is already there, you can't put a turbine in every single reservoir, but for those that you can, that little incremental can make a difference. That's one way. Another way is a lot of the hydro fleet in the US, like in Canada, is actually built in the 1950s, for example. So it's coming to the end of its useful life for the electric and mechanical equipment. So when refurbishing a power plant, you can increase the capacity or the efficiency to get more energy that way. So if you speak to folks in the US at the National Hydropower Association, they're not really pushing for new stream reach. They're looking more at the power and non-power dams and increasing capacity through refurbishments.
Perfect.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for that. First of all, a big round of applause for the speakers for sharing their perspectives and taking their time. And thank you all for joining us. And I wish you all have a good rest of the days at the COP. Thank you.